Inflation is already here. The trillions of dollars in fresh worldwide stimulus are causing the price of nearly everything we depend on to rise sharply in price. Global food prices continue to surge. Food prices are undeniably soaring faster than inflation and incomes around the world. Food is another method of controlling the masses when the elite are the only ones who can afford it. Following are top 3 tips on how to survive the coming inflationary times. Number 1. Learn to grow your own food to augment what you buy. Number 2. Stock up on dry goods and emergency supplies. And number 3. Whatever you do, purchase a Buodet for your toilets. Helps augment during a toilet paper shortage. Pooporri won't hurt either. The biggest bang for your buck is going to be using your own labor. If you own your own house, the best thing to do is your own plumbing, carpentry, electrical, and yard work. Almost everything but big jobs can be done by everyone with just a little knowledge that you can get on YouTube. I've done almost everything except roofing and HVAC replacement. History reveals famines and epidemics go hand in hand. The US politicians have been allowed to weaponize their citizens' food supply through lobbying and are prepared to watch 300 million people starve to death. The USA is being turned into a third world country. Neutralizing and demonizing the American citizens and the men who could stop them is nearly complete. Remember, the global population of 500 million. Only the children, their future slaves, will be spared. I don't know why so many people cannot see this. I wonder if Bill Gates buying as much farmlands as he can in the US has anything to do with that matter. Y'all better start gardening and planting fruit trees. Food shortages will be here within the next decade or so. Get self-reliant on all sides of life: food, shelter, knowledge. Never depend on the government for anything. The dollars that you work hard for are always buying less and less, yet the government tells you there's not enough inflation. The Federal Reserve is a government-created monopoly that counterfeits dollars by the billions and trillions. The GDP growth is now under 4%. The official inflation is over 2%. Manufacturing, as a percentage of GDP, is now the lowest it has been in 74 years, 1947. The Fed Ponzi created a banana republic. We certainly don't produce anything except bombs and Ponzi money. For the first time ever that the American $100 bills have exceeded the amount of $1 bills in circulation. I'd say it's Fed mission accomplished. Growing a garden is now more subversive than owning a gun. I can't wait to get my vegetable and herb garden going this year. The Greatest Depression is coming. Time to move back to the farm. They are keeping the bubble going and not popping yet. Massive credit and zero interest rates will give us another 3 to 5 years before we have the next panic, crisis, catastrophe. The Fed is just blowing this bubble higher. The spike looks forced and seems like they don't want anyone to realize what's going on. Although the Fed's preferred measure of inflation has been stable in a range of 1.3% to 2.0% for over 4 years now. The truth is more like 6 to 8% and increasing as I type this. The Federal Reserve System's primary official mandate is to maintain prices stable. The reality is that the Federal Reserve is responsible for all of the inflation we have experienced since the Fed's creation in 1913. How much inflation is that, you would ask? Well, consider that the value of the American dollar has decreased by more than 95% in that time, and this is according to the government's own Bureau of Labor Statistics itself. And here is how the Fed actually creates inflation into the system. First, by monetizing government debt. When the government's expenses exceed its income, which they always do, the Treasury Department issues bonds. These bonds are sold at auction to make up for the shortfall. Anyone, including individuals like you and me, can place bids on these bonds. Foreign governments, especially China, are major buyers, but so is the Federal Reserve, and here's the magic trick. When the Fed buys $1 million worth of government bonds, it can pay for them with a check, and, unlike when you or I write a check, the Fed doesn't need to have any money in its account. The amount of the check is backed by whatever it is purchasing. Thus, when the Fed writes a check for $1 million, it creates $1 million in new money. This is, by definition, inflation, and it inevitably causes prices to rise. Second, by making loans to member banks. 38% of all banks in the U.S. are members of the Federal Reserve System, which means that they own stock in one of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. It also means that they are eligible to borrow directly from the Fed at its discount window. This rate is set by the Fed, and, as you might imagine, money lent to member banks is created out of thin air by the Fed. It monetizes the bank's debt too. The Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort to its member banks, who are thus guaranteed a bailout at the Fed's option. After all, no matter how irresponsible a member bank's practices, the Fed could always come in and create enough money to bail it out, and this creates what economists call moral hazard in the economy. And finally, by setting reserve requirements for banks. The Federal Reserve regulates all banks, not just member ones, and it has the authority to set reserve requirements for banking institutions throughout the economy. In a free market, the reserve requirement would be 100% banks would not be able to loan funds they did not have. However, thanks to the government-enforced cartel system created by the Federal Reserve Act, banks can produce up to $9,000 in new money for every $1,000 on deposit. That's because, under the current 10% reserve requirement, banks can loan up to $900 of a $1,000 demand deposit, but then if that $900 loan is deposited at the same or another bank, up to 90% of it can be lent, and so on, until the $1,000 makes $10,000 total, $9,000 in new money. Indeed, this is probably the biggest engine of inflation in the economy. Inflation is not inevitable, it only arises from an expansion of the money supply, and only the Fed controls the money supply. This is why it is so outrageous that one of the mandates of the Fed is to maintain stable prices. However, it is essential to note that inflation is not synonymous with rising costs. In fact, if there were a steady money supply, prices of goods and services would go down with time, as advances in productivity and accumulation of capital make things cheaper in real, inflation-adjusted, terms. Thus, hidden in the Fed's stable prices mandate is the promise to inflate the money supply, and this represents theft on a massive scale. Who gets the money when the Fed creates it? A privileged class. The rest of us are cheated by higher prices. This is why the issue of the Federal Reserve is so vital, it is the one issue that is the crux of it all. As the architect of inflation, the Federal Reserve is also the primary cause for the bull market in gold and silver. This, of course, does not mean we should thank Bernanke and crew. The irony of it all is that once people wake up to what the Fed is doing, and they are beginning to wake up, it will create an even bigger bull market for precious metals. All fiat money systems throughout history have failed. Ours will not be the exception. Only gold and silver are eternal. The Fed causes inflation, among other evil things they do, but there's an overlooked aspect to their inflation that doesn't really get mentioned. We see the price increase but forget that the actual percent of inflation that they cause is higher than just the increase you see in prices, because without the Fed doing what they do, prices would actually tend to decrease. Humans get better at producing things, not worse. The bread used to cost 5 cents, and now it's $3. We've only gotten better at producing bread, farming techniques have only gotten better to produce wheat, shipping has only gotten cheaper. Bread shouldn't be 5 cents. Still, it should be 3 or 2. Gas prices go up while our ability to drill and manufacture has gotten better and better. Gas should be cheaper now than it was in the 1950s. The motivation for generating inflation is to keep the banks solvent, and paying enormous and free compensations, and tax dollars flowing to bureaucrats, to spend more with huge free compensation. Banks and bureaucrats, the nexus of which is the Fed. The Fed and its economist lapdogs are making it up as they go along. It looks like all of their financial friends have been made whole, and then some, and have been well provided for. I prefer not to think about the US dollar going full Venezuelan. And despite assurances from the intellectual types, that could and will happen extremely quickly and potentially overnight. Massive and crushing inflation is the only way for the Fed and government to paper its way out of this significant credit and debt fiasco. Our fearless enlightened leadership is like the proverbial hamster running on the wheel of doom. Inflation is a backdoor tax and is illegal under the Constitution as it blatantly debauches the currency. But the Constitution has been irrelevant for a long, long time. The only question is what degree of hyperinflation will the Fed need to get the government out of its trillion-dollar deficits before it all implodes. It's hyperinflation or bust. And they even claim, we know how to control inflation. My guess would be an immediate minimum 50% drop in the standard of living for the average schmo. Best case scenario. The Fed is doing exactly what they were hired to do.